My name is Martin Bunton. I'm the interim director at the Center for Global Studies, filling in for Oliver Schmidtka, who is the director of the center and currently on a one-year research leave in Europe. I hope you've all had a good week and are recovering from the atmospheric rivers that, at least here in BC, we've been dealing with, although I know the whole issue of flooding isn't unfamiliar to Australia as well. So I will take a moment to introduce the series, and then I will turn it over to Andrew Buck to introduce the speakers. But first, let me acknowledge and respect the Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the Center for Global Studies here at UVic stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasonic peoples whose historical relationships to the land continue to this day. I'd also like to say a few words just around sort of what we call housekeeping issues. We'll ask on these Zoom webinars, we'll ask that you please keep your video and your microphone muted for the course of the webinar, but then when it's time for questions and answers, it would be welcome if you could turn your video and your microphone, well, and obviously your microphone on to ask the questions. So now I'll turn it over to Andrew Buck, who will please introduce our speakers. So thank you all for coming this afternoon. Andrew.
Thanks very much, Martin. Well, as many of you know, this is the last of the 2021 presentations for the Property and Dispossession series. And I've been sort of saving this up for sort of our festive sort of event because to conclude, I can't think of a better way of concluding rather than with this presentation and with these two people. One of the principal sort of ideas behind this series has been to look at peoples who are doing new and exciting work on the question of property and its relationship to the question of dispossession. And one of the things that I've tried very hard to do is get a group of people who have been working from different methodological perspectives, and those methodological perspectives have been, you know, from the world of history, from the world of political theory, from the world of literature. And so it's really exciting to have the two presenters that we've got today. And what's different about the two presenters that we've got today is that up until now, we've looked at people who have recently published work. For today, we're looking at people who are about to publish work, whose book is imminent, and who I'm absolutely certain after this presentation, we will be on tenterhooks watching the airwaves as to when it actually is going to be published. I came across the ideas that both John and Christy are working through in an absolutely wonderful article that I came across in the University of New South Wales Law Journal last year. And it touches upon many of what I assume will be the ideas and the themes that they'll be talking about. I should also say a point about the individuals themselves. Christy Clark teaches law at the University of Canberra in Australia, and John Page, who, let's face it, John, I have known for some years. John teaches law and is professor at Southern Cross University in New South Wales in Australia.
Our book chronicles, as its title suggests, a critical history of property, protest and spatial justice, a tale that begins in the pre-Norman forests of England and concludes in the urban forests of pandemic-era London, Sydney and Melbourne. Ours are stories of shadow revolutions and their social movements and the faint hopes that their prefigurative utopian-like imaginings of another future offer for our grim and contemporary times. In particular, our account is one that focuses on our relations with space and how one particular spatial paradigm has come to dominate, namely the laws and theories of private property and its unequal, exclusionary and alienating effects. But in telling property's dominant narrative, our story also examines, and indeed foregrounds, property's other laws and customs, the subordinate relational stories that have been pushed to the periphery or lost to plain sight. As the truism goes, one can easily lose sight of the forest for the trees, a reflection on the very human tendency to focus on the pressing, atomized minutiae at front of mind and its logical corollary, an overlooking of the bigger collective picture. For the Lawful Forest, this truism speaks to our myopia around private property and its universalizing narratives, and the failure to see the longer view, pluralist context of our diverse relationships to space. This forgetfulness is not simply an outcome of omission, a kind of generational overlay of spatial memory loss. Rather, it is what Nicholas Blomley calls a conscious project, one founded on the partisan interests of the proponents of enclosure and colonialism and their methodologies of erasure, dispossession, violence, and theft. Nor is this conscious project an historical one that has run its course, as if one could technically draw the line under enclosure, for example, with Octavia Hill's Commons Preservation Societies of 19th century London. Rather, it's an ongoing, very modern tale that recycles improvement discourse into newer linguistic form, a constant shape-shifting of terminology, now privatisation, gentrification, financialisation, and their neoliberal ilk. As you may be beginning to surmise, in telling these stories of property's dominant and subordinate, our use of the term property is wide-ranging and non-technical, broadly describing property as the sum of our diverse relationships with space. In particular, it focuses on our relations with land. The implications of seeing property in such an open-ended way is to recognise its inherent diversity and plurality. The implication of focusing on land is to reinforce its finitude. As Jeremy Waldron pithily observes, quote, "Everything that is done has to be done somewhere. No one is free to perform an action unless there is somewhere he, Sick, is free to perform it," end quote. So our book lies at the intersection of a number of scholarly influences, the emerging theories of critical property, the counter-narratives of critical history, and the core tenets of legal geography. Critical property theory rejects the assumed hegemony and fixity of private property, arguing instead that property is diverse and dynamic in its hybrid ways. It is similarly critical in its rejection of property as a series of abstract relations between persons about things, Wesley Hofield's famously reductive summation of the institution. Instead, it prefers an interpretation that is grounded in context, a materialist view that legal geographers have made clear in their equally clear-sighted analysis that law and place do not live in separate boxes, or what Iris Braverman and others describe as law's worldedness. Third, it is critical in its critique of the spatial injustice of a particular version of property and the enclosing exclusionary spatial orderings it carves into landscapes and zealously enforces. And finally, taking a critical perspective on history, identifies similarly or seemingly isolated times of disruption that run counter to the dominant narrative of enclosure, where the possibilities of different spatial paradigms offer their own counter-narratives, revealing in their flash of incandescence the possibilities of alternate spatial paths seldom taken. These disruptive accounts are not intended to be exhaustive. Rather, they are selective, sometimes eclectic, stories where the communitarian many runs interference against the few's enclosing ways. While enclosure's trajectory may indeed appear linear, we argue in our book that this is neither preordained nor inevitable. Our book highlighting times of inflection when this linearity is vulnerable to disruption and throwing into stark relief those other spatial alternatives that materialise before disappearing from plain sight. So in the Lawful Forest, we employ the forest as a metaphor. It is at once physical and metaphysical, a literal space of trees, woods and greenery, and a haunting presence of forests that once were. The metaphysical forest represents a relational understanding of people and space, an ancient spatial ordering with consequences for community, the society it emplaces and informs, and its environmental context. We describe this forest as lawful because the stories we focus on are grounded in the law. They reflect the common laws oft overlooked plurality and the significance of social context. Its lawfulness also stems from the residue of ancient forest laws and their related communitarian practices and customs that continue to haunt what Nicole Graham calls or describes as the dominant lawscape. Lawfulness also reflects these laws' collective legitimacy, validated by the ground-up actions of the many, not the top-down diktat of the few. In their diversity and plurality, these lawful narratives run counter to modern legal orthodoxy, where legal practice prefers a unitary, detached approach. In this vein, lawful also reminds us of the need to engage with the law beyond its narrow black letter. Legal forests may flourish and grow in their self-contained, self-referential worlds, statute, regulation, and case law. This, or such a worldview, makes it tempting to dismiss this shallow layer of black letter doctrine as the law. Yet the law is more depthy, more ingrained in its stories than its black letter thinness supposes. From time to time, this metaphysical abstract ideal of the lawful forest, the other duality, takes material shape through diverse enactments of utopias or prefigurative politics. Davina Cooper has written about these everyday utopias, what she calls real-world sites of conceptual potency and innovation with an extraordinary potential to, quote, revitalise progressive and radical politics and put everyday concepts into practice in counter-normative ways, end quote. Australian property theorist Margaret Davies similarly emphasises theory's centrality to utopian thinking, writing that, quote, theory has an important role in reimagining the world and prefiguring the future, end quote. A lesson we too make central to our thesis. Finally, our story is one written for our present time of precarity, on the cusp of escalating existential crises, the climate emergency, apocalyptic wildfires, global pandemics, the end days of late-stage capitalism, where David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession nears its inexorable conclusion and the final enclosure of our earthly commons looms. Our faint hope is that these counter-stories we depict in our book may demonstrate by their example and their performance the viability of other spatial ways less destructive and less consumptive. The Lawful Forest opens with a literary flourish, a nod to its inclusion in a critical series of law, literature, and the humanities. We begin with a vignette writing, quote, in 2016, speculative fiction writer William Gibson faced a unique dilemma. Gibson found that he was unable to finish his current book because it was set in a present that no longer existed. Perversely, the future had become now. Gibson almost put the book aside for good, thinking, this is never going to happen, and it really threw me for about 6 months. All I could do was read the news feed and feel worse about that. But eventually, I realised that I wanted to believe I was living in a stub, that something had split off and that things weren't supposed to be this way. It wasn't supposed to be as dire, end quote. Gibson's sense of dread is one that many of us have shared, a dread that has only intensified since 2016, of being blindsided by a dire turn of events and the speed with which a future dystopia seems to be approaching. Of course, private property is not solely responsible for this dreadful turn of events. We have arrived at this precipice for many multiple reasons. But that is not our property brief in this book, nor is it hard to overstate the influence of what English activist and blogger Nick Hayes calls private property's cult of exclusion, or what Nicole Graham argues is the consequence of private property's penchant for abstraction and dephysicalisation, making it, quote, one of the most significant contributions of modern Anglophonic law to anthropogenic environmental change. As noted, our book explores selective moments that run against the linear grain. And in seeking to disrupt this very linearity, we begin in chapter 1 in 21st century Detroit, the poster child of urban decline, or what Claire Herbert calls the failed city. Detroit, outside its mostly white gentrifying core of Midtown and downtown, the so-called 7.2, suffers from a flip side consequence of enclosure, a scenario where there is spatially nothing of value left to enclose. So-called urban prairies, desolate landscapes of abandoned houses, empty lots, defunct city services and waist-high grass are almost unimaginable to Australian eyes accustomed to the other end of enclosure spectrum, the hyper-commodification of Australian cities and their unaffordable real estate. In the next chapter, we go back to a time before the common law's legal memory, the ancient lawful forests of pre-Norman England and their polyglot of diverse tenures and customary practices. All this, of course, predated the invasion and the conqueror's forest laws, the so-called acme of Norman despotism, which afforested vast tracts of the English landmass as private game parks, think of the New Forest, and enclosed commoners' forest rights. Our special interest lies in the Forest Charter of 1217, a statute remarkable for its longevity. It remained good law for 750 or so years, its near invisibility compared to its twin, the Magna Carta, and above all, its pushback against privilege. The Forest Charter, in its brief 17 chapters, restored the rights and privileges of what it described in Article 17 as the forest's, quote, good and lawful men, preferring communal rights to the private privilege of the lay and ecclesiastically powerful. This remarkable instrument set the stage for later chapters and the dispersal, diaspora-like, of the Charter's forest liberties to the rural commons and beyond. Chapter 4 next describes what we call the glimpsed utopias of 14th to 16th century England, highlighting the Peasants' Rebellion of 1381 and Thomas More's fictional account of a communal utopia. Chapter 5 then shifts temporal gear, exploring the grounded utopias of Kett's Rebellion of 1549 and its camping times, and the diggers' camps of post-Civil War England, to then the Paris Commune of 1871, before landing in the same city nearly a century later, and its articulation of Henri Lefebvre's right to the city. Christie will speak to Kett's Rebellion and its evocatively named commotion time in the next section. Our case studies conclude with a return to the forest, but this time the ancient temperate forests and rainforests of Eastern Australia and their quirky tales of countercultural communards and forest protesters. Chapter 6 then ends with a 2017 High Court judgment, Brown and the State of Tasmania, a key authority in Australian law for the implied constitutional freedom of political communication. This judgment, however, also speaks of the public forest estate and a recognition of ancient public rights, a series of subtle references that first piqued our interest in lawful forests and revealed on further inspection a lawful antecedents that looped all the way back to the Forest Charter and perhaps earlier. And this was the UNSW journal article to which Andrew referred to in his opening comments. By way of digging deeper into the granular, I will close my part of this presentation by turning to one of our case studies from this era and from this genre, the 1979 forest protests of Terrania Creek in northern New South Wales. The rainforests of Terrania Creek form part of the lands of the Widjabul peoples, country that I acknowledged in my opening remarks. Literally, if I stand up from my chair, I can see the rainforest-shrouded hills of the Nightcap Ranges from my study window, the ancient Gondwana greenery, which protesters successfully saved from progress and improvement. This case study was set in an epochal moment when a growing sense of alienation from the city and the emergence of an environmental protest movement converged. At the height of the countercultural age of Aquarius, waves of tertiary educated youth escaped urban life in Sydney and Melbourne, seeking radical alternative lifestyles in rural intentional communities. The seminal moment of Australian hippiedom was the Australian University of Students-sponsored Aquarius Festival at Nimbin in 1973, Australia's answer to Woodstock. Its zeitgeist was about, amongst other values and pleasures, a return to the land, its green forests, and the forging of new relationships with community. Theirs was an ecological commons, one where the city is hardly needed, and where land custodians, not owners, quote, repaired the ravages of previous land use battles and lived in accord with the natural environment, end quote. These Aquarian communards were at the vanguard of forest protests at nearby Terrania Creek 6 years later in August 1979. Unlike Woodstock, many of the Aquarius festival goers chose to stay in the area, setting up intentional communities or multiple occupancies or MOs in the hills around Nimbin, where land was then cheap and the climate mostly warm, creating what architectural scholar Lee Stickles calls a demographically transformed countercultural terroir. The flashpoint at Terrania Creek involved plans by the New South Wales Forestry Commission to log a small coop of old-growth rainforest and buffer eucalypts, part of what locals colloquially once called the Big Scrub, which was cleared in a few decades of frenzied felling in the late 19th century that left a mere 1% of forest remaining. Regarded as revolutionising Australian forest protests through principles of non-violent direct action, the Terrania Creek blockade set a precedent for practices of lawful dissent across Australia and have been portrayed as the departure point for a new and distinctly Australian protest culture of environmental activism. The anti-logging campaign began in 1974 when these so-called new settlers uncovered plans by the Forestry Commission to log the rainforest and replace it with eucalypt plantation timber. The 5-year period from 74 to 79 saw the newly formed Terrania Native Forest Action Group engage in so-called polite protest, when, quote, conservationists acted within the boundaries of perceived social norms, using legitimate social practices like letter writing, petitions, political lobbying, raising public awareness in the hope that respectful conduct would be met with a respectful response, end quote. Yet even during this phase, activist academic Vanessa Bible points to the uniqueness of the group's decision-making that pushed the boundaries and forged new tactics. Its tiny membership of 7 to 10 forest residents drew on their collective academic skills, with backgrounds in environmental science, architecture, engineering, advertising, art, and music, to devise new and innovative ways to fight the Forestry Commission. These included challenging the scientific expertise of the Commission itself and the initiation of citizen science transect surveys to gain a better understanding of the forests under threat. Other responses reflected the creativity of the Aquarian communards who lived in nearby MOs. Musicians composed protest songs, and the advertising executive devised a local TV ad that depict logging trucks on the same narrow dirt roads as school buses. By mid-1979, political factions within the New South Wales government had taken entrenched and opposing sides in the escalating debate. That this issue had such an outsized influence in faraway Sydney was testament to the Terranians' lobbying prowess. Timber industry unions and Conservative ministers in their thrall were implacably against the protesters. Other MPs were more sympathetic, including then Planning Minister Paul Lander, who encouraged the mobilising of wide community support that took local form through the Alternative Society Press and at market stalls. The Terrania Native Forest Action Group believed that logic would eventually prevail. So when plans were suddenly announced for logging to begin in August, they were unprepared and flat-footed. What followed next was spontaneous and grassroots, the setting up of a protest camp on the last private land before the state forest began, with equally spontaneous plans for a forest blockade coalescing on the ground as a default position. Within a short time, 300 protesters were camping at the Nicholson property, transforming it into a tent city, complete with 24-hour running hot water, toilets, a camp oven and creches. As is often observed of protest in the Lawful Forest, the camp was described in festive terms, amazingly spontaneous and vibrant, notwithstanding the tensions that lay at its heart. On the morning of 14 August 1979, principles of non-violence, civil disobedience and consensus decision-making collided with loggers and police in large numbers. As the Sydney Tribune newspaper reported of the police operation, quote, the New South Wales Labor government has sent in a special police force of over 100 officers, costing $250,000 so far. At most, the logging revenues will bring the state $45,000, end quote. Later, the Terrania Creek inquiry, which was headed up by retired Supreme Court Judge Justice Simon Isaacs, would eventually cost over $1 million. After 4 weeks of stalemate between loggers and protesters, a political compromise of sorts was reached, which halted logging, initiated the Isaacs judicial inquiry, and eventually saw the gazettal of the Nightcap National Park in 1983, 4 years later, a World Heritage Site that includes Terrania Creek and a waterfall named in honour of the Terranians, Protester Falls. Tree sittings, bulldozer obstructions, road sabotages, theatrical protest, and other innovative strategies were trialled at Terrania Creek and found successful. This was a spontaneous organic protest that aligned with the exigencies of the moment and the evolving spirit of the times. As was observed at the time, quote, it has the Aquarian touch, light, forward-looking, innovative, pretentious, real and relevant to the times, end quote. So from the makeshift festive camps of the Terrania protesters to the camping times on Mousehold Heath in 16th century England, our book shifts back and forth across time and space, identifying points of societal inflection when the trajectory of enclosure missed a beat and other ways of relating to land took on a glimpse or concrete form. I shall now pass over to Christy, who will take us back to an earlier tale of the Lawful Forest.
Thank you, John. In the mid-1500s, as the population of England returned to pre-plague levels after a century and a half of contraction, it was faced with a scarcity of land and labour and increasing civil unrest fuelled by popular resistance to both enclosure and the Henrician Reformation. After the death of Henry VIII, this civil unrest culminated in the winter of 1549 with a period known as the Commotion Time, during which significant rebellions erupted in counties across England. Unlike the rebellions of the past, such as the Peasants' Rebellion of 1381 or the early enclosure riots, this revolt moved beyond riots, property destruction, and marching on London to a practice that could be described as utopian prefigurative politics. And it did this by establishing camps. The East Anglian Revolt, for example, included 6 rebel camps and was characterised in the aftermath as the camping time. The longest lasting and best known of these camps was established in July by somewhere between 6,000 and 20,000 rebels at Mousehold Heath, outside Norwich. Under an oak tree they named the Oak of the Reformation. It came to be known as Kett's Rebellion, after a yeoman named Robert Kett, who took a leadership role in its establishment. Historian Jim Holston describes the camp as the greatest practical utopian project of Tudor England, and perhaps superlatively the greatest anti-capitalist rising in English history. The rebels themselves consisted of a pragmatic alliance between the landless, the peasantry, and wealthier yeomen such as Kett himself, who competed with the gentry in the rural economy. They were motivated by both economic and religious reasons, but resistance to enclosure was chief amongst their concerns. Once they'd established camp at Mousehold Heath, Kett and the rebel campers organised an alternative government. From the seat of the Oak of the Reformation, they issued warrants and, after kidnapping the wanted gentlemen, held court and imprisoned those found guilty. They also ran a thriving camp kitchen with food requisitioned from the local gentry and held regular church services. There's evidence that the campers were supported by crowdfunding, with representatives from North Eltham, for example, being paid wages and supplied with food with funds pooled from the town's residents. The rebels at Mousehold Heath corresponded with Lord Protector Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, who was the de facto leader of England during the first 2.5 years of King Edward's minority, and was initially sympathetic to their cause. Through this correspondence, they petitioned the king, calling amongst other things for a reduction of rents and food prices, and that no man shall enclose any more, lord of no manor shall common upon the common, rivers may be free and common to all men for fishing and passage, and all bondmen may be made free, for God made all free with his precious bloodshedding. On the 28th of August, after the rebels had rejected 3 offers of royal pardon, which required them to disperse without their demands being met, the final battle took place and the rebels were soundly defeated by the royal army. Between 2,000 and 3,500 rebels are estimated to have died in battle, and a further 250 royal soldiers. In the aftermath, many rebels were arrested for their involvement, with 9 ringleaders being hanged on the Oak of the Reformation. Robert Kett himself and his brother William were captured and taken to the Tower of London for trial. After being found guilty of treason, they too were sentenced to be hanged. The rebellions in the commotion time were part of a long history of struggles around the role of the common people in the government of the day and related contestations around the meaning and purpose of property. During this era, property was still understood as a bundle of overlapping and often non-exclusive rights and obligations, and the task for the enclosers was to establish a new understanding of property as private and territorially bounded concept, and to assert the legitimacy of this conception. Nicholas Blomley describes this emerging conception of property as increasingly disembedded from local social conditions, making it possible to treat property as an abstract relation between an owner and a thing rather than a conditional tenure associated with obligations to others. Struggles over enclosure were also thus struggles over the legitimacy of this new attempt to construct private property as private and commodified, and over the implications of this construction for the commons, in both senses of the word, a point I'll come back to in a moment. This long history included waves of anti-enclosure riots and other forms of opposition from the late 15th century, if not earlier. While many of these took place in rural areas, there was a early wave of urban enclosure riots between around 1480 and 1525 in towns across England. Christian Liddy argues that these urban riots were about the infringement and loss of collective rights because the conception of citizenship was viewed through a spatial lens, which made urban dwellers highly sensitive to any encroachment upon communal space. This was further emphasised by the fact that the word commons was used to mean both common people, i.e. commoners or the constitutional class of those who work, and their communal property. Communal property was not only a source of livelihood and economic power, but an important site for participating in public life and strengthening the relationships within the commons as a populace and between them and their commons, the land. Liddy argues the maintenance of town commons was considered to be a barometer of good government. Reflecting on this understanding, commoners employed both the language of rights and the conception of the common weal to imbue their claims and even their riots with a sense of legitimacy. David Rawlinson argues that from the time of the 1381 Peasants' Rebellion until around 1649, this conception of the common weal defined the constitutional culture of the age. These wider struggles focus particularly on questions of power and the degree of popular inclusion in town government. In a scene that pre-echoed Trump's tweet rage against the Mayor of DC over the Black Lives Matter protests in the city, the deeper political significance of these urban enclosure riots was hinted at in the reported reaction of Henry VII, who summoned the Mayor of York to Greenwich in February 1495 to warn him to get his city in order. Or I must and will put in other rulers that will rule and govern the city according to my laws. Kett's rebellion and the commotion time more broadly is particularly interesting in that it involved prefigurative politics, as I mentioned. These are the performance or construction of working models of alternative utopian realities. And although on one level it ultimately failed, it had a lasting impact on the politics of the day and on the popular understanding of what was possible. Similar arguments could also be made, and indeed we do make them, about the utopian projects that follow, the diggers' colonies of 17th century England, the Paris Commune, and more recently, Occupy. All of the examples explored in our book highlight the fact that property provides the context for abstract legal theory to be performed. As a result, the commodification and dephysicalisation of property has significant implications for our relationships with each other and with the ecosystem. We're seeing these implications play out daily, with manufactured scarcity driving up the price of housing, leaving many unhoused and many more living in housing stress. We also see it in the brutal policing of who is entitled to occupy public space. And of course, we see it in the latest stage of David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession, with the livability of our planet seemingly up for sale. Our book explores a fault line between two tectonic forces. On the one hand, the seemingly inexorable progress of enclosure, and on the other, the resistance to its rational linear logic and ostensibly unstoppable trajectory. Through stories of rupture, of times when these tectonic forces collided in plainer view, the Lawful Forest critical history of the last millennia reveals continuities, ongoing, recurring moments of societal inflection. We argue these inflection points are profound because they bring into sharper focus the nature of our relations with land as both a physical space and the abstract spatial orderings that property and its laws enliven. These inflection points reveal the spatial choices made over time, where the common weal confronts private wealth and the linear path of enclosure is briefly disrupted before the status quo resumes. Critically, they provide the briefest glimpses into other paths not taken, those spatial alternatives that would appear as random aberrations, but for a longer term critical view of land and its history. These other paths are arguably more important now than ever as we approach a critical point in history where the ever escalating climate crisis, the global pandemic, and rolling political disruption all hint or even shout at what has been described as the unravelling or Gibson's jackpot. In exploring this rich history, our book seeks to understand how property and its related spatial ordering has come to be understood through such a narrow ideological prism, and relatedly why we are now standing on the precipice of ecological collapse. It's past time to critically scrutinise these other spatial paths their historical lessons little learnt, and their glimpsed promises of shadow revolutions that at best were only fleetingly enacted. These commonalities or continuities between these other paths are this book's recurring themes and stories of hope, the critical histories of property, protest, and claims to spatial justice. Central to understanding common law property and its role in this book's critical history is to acknowledge its inherent plurality. It's also to realise how comprehensively this plurality has been erased in plain sight. Our book demonstrates that the conceptualisation of property as exclusively private is a relatively recent phenomenon, but it's the culmination of a vast investment made by the partisan, self-interested proponents of enclosure. Through stories that reflect the reality of plurality, the book highlights the significance of context. Pluralism remains a pleasant reality, but we're conditioned to be blind to it because of the process of decontextualisation has been so far-reaching and so total. Thomas Steinberg's Real Property Isn't, or Nicole Graham's Lawscape, amongst others, are scholarly endeavours that seek to recentre property law to its material origins and to the particularities of context. The many performances of property plurality documented in the book demonstrate how diverse tenures emanate from the ground up. But the book also emphasises the power of words. Language has also always been a key tool of enclosure. Words are effective at constructing reality such that we can no longer see what is in plain sight. As Blomley observes, if certain spaces do not look like property to us, we've tended to ignore them. So terms such as improvement, efficiency, progress, or particularise are technicalities that hide a brutal history, euphemisms for enclosure's often violent dispossession of the other. In this context, legal pluralism is a threat to private hegemony, such that words that remind us of its extant state are dismissed as not propertied or illegitimate in sanctioned property discourse. Our critical history of protest is chiefly a record of resistance to spatial enclosure, from the physicality of the rural commons to the metaphysicality of the right to the city. Yet what lies beneath the subliminal subtext to the bright lines of anti-enclosure protest is a more threshold resistance to social control, the low-level repressive violence that goes into maintaining the status quo. What is telling from the critical history is that often protests were demands that the law be upheld, not defied. Enclosure was originally a breach of the common law, such that the anti-enclosure riots, early legal suits, and practical actions such as hedge breaking were all made in furtherance of the law, not against it. Yet when the law is administered and enforced by lawbreakers, the imperatives of protest shift over time, from adherence to defiance of unjust laws. The camping time or commotions of 1549, for example, saw large-scale utopian protest camps spring up in defence of the commons. These times also presaged increasingly violent patterns of repression and erasure by the state and others. From the diggers' proto-communist landed experiments to the Paris Commune and its notions of communal luxury, echoing earlier politics of the common weal, and the manifestation of Lefebvre's right to the city in Paris 1968, it's clear that pushing back against enclosure took multiple forms, both material and intellectual. Similarly, the rural communes and hippie ideals of the age of Aquarius were wellsprings of forest protest in modern-day Australia. Protests that closed the loop of sorts by reminding us of latent forest liberties and ancient traditions of defending the lawful forests in the public square. Across time and space, public or communitarian space was and remains a flashpoint and situs of protest. After all, this was the terrain, physical and abstract, that enclosure sought to extinguish. During the recent COVID-19 pandemic, current, we have, for example, seen the criminalisation of protest, with public health orders being used as a convenient cover to outlaw protests in public space. As Black Lives Matter protests spread into the streets, police in the United States were accused of exploiting public health curfews to criminalise and violently harass people protesting police brutality. In the Australian state of New South Wales, public health orders were also used to repeatedly shut down Black Lives Matter protests planned for city streets and parks. Finally, the critical history of spatial justice explored in the book highlights the fact that it's land scarcity and the grievance over its uneven distribution that lies deeply unresolved on the forest floor. This uneven distribution plays out in different ways. The physical enclosure of space within private fences and its universal dispossession of the many is, after all, the inexorable logic of enclosure. In pandemic London, such spatial inequality is depicted in the unsettling scenes described by Monbiot of Londoners sweltering in tiny flats or edging round each other in minuscule parks, desperate for a sense of space and freedom. Transfer that imagery from London to cities in the global south, such as New Delhi, and the tragedy of spatial inequity is only magnified in its tragic consequences. The book explores multiple examples of spatial injustice across history, from the dispossession of common rights in afforested land, through the Norman forest laws, to the use of the statute of labourers to block claims to freedom of movement and labour power as the manorial system began to crumble, to the early acts of enclosure to support the burgeoning commercial wool industry. Wool likewise played an oversized role in Indigenous dispossession in parts of colonial Australia, where vast squatting runs for sheep grazing were stolen from Indigenous owners, creating a bunyip aristocracy that mimicked the English upper class in their manorial estates and penchant for spatial injustice. Kett's Rebellion likewise focused on spatial inequity. A key driver of popular dissent was the rise of a landless class, an early example of commodified land driving people to destitution, a development with potent parallels to modern-day urban homelessness, and the architecture of vagrancy acts, move-on laws, and hostile architectural design that perpetuates this particular version of spatial injustice. In the early 21st century, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated underlying issues of spatial injustice, with significant evidence of the discriminatory and selective enforcement of public health orders against specific population groups. These discriminatory enforcement practices merely build on a long history of over-policing of particular groups in society, often through the selective use of stop and search or move-on powers, and laws that prohibit loitering, offensive language, or public drunkenness. In this way, policing serves to regulate who is permitted to occupy public space and under what or whose conditions. Whether measured in crude acreage, access to public amenities, or the implications of racism, environmental racism, colonialism, or the distributive inequities of capital, our critical history of spatial justice highlights how the contours of private property match the geographies of spatial injustice. As David Delaney writes on critical geography and its unmasking of power relations, our ambition is similar in scope. Critical geography is indispensable for revealing the workings of power that conventional spatial imaginaries obscure, and for identifying the whys, hows, and wheres of injustice that are otherwise invisibilised or legitimised. Thank you.
As I attempt to get my image back, which may take some time. Thank you very much to both of you. I mean, just wonderful, as I expected upon reading the article. And now I'm even more keen to read the book when it finally comes out. And one thing, before I open it up to questions, that the two of you, I would really encourage you to delve into the politics of the protests against old growth deforestation that are currently taking place in British Columbia, because it's so incredibly relevant to exactly what some of the themes of your book are. I mean, so...
That'll have to be volume 2.
Yeah, that'll have to be volume 2, perhaps. However, I know there are going to be many questions, and I'm taking these in order of the faces as they appeared. John, did you have a question? Your sound is off.
I don't have a question right now, Andrew, but I find it a wonderful presentation, and you are absolutely correct in making the link to deforestation in our neighborhood. particularly in southern Vancouver Island. So pass on to somebody else and I'll put my thinking cap on.
Well, as I recall, it was actually Bruce that came up next. Is that correct, Bruce?
I didn't realize by turning my camera on that I was, in fact, indicating a need to ask a question and a desire to ask a question. But nonetheless, I just wanted to say how very much I enjoyed it. This notion of resistance. It's something that people have been looking at more and more frequently in legal history over the past generation, as Andrew knows, more than most. The forms of resistance, I'm an Australian legal historian now living in New Zealand, but the forms of resistance resistance to law as they apply to land and so on, of course, the first thing we talk about is Indigenous resistance. It's a way of looking at those resistances which began in the 18th century in Australia.
Indeed. Well, since my long-standing friends and colleagues didn't actually have questions, I'm now going to turn to Alison, who I believe really might have a question.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, John and Christy, for the talk, which was fantastic. I do have questions, so I've got a few actually, but so I might just sprinkle one or two in to start with, and then see if others have questions too. So I think, Christy, at one point in your talk, you used the phrase the lawful forest and the town square, protecting the lawful forest and the town square. And so one of my questions is, it seems to me that there might be differences, or there might be important distinctions between forests and town squares. How easy is it to talk about the two of them together? Obviously, in some ways, property law flattens out the distinctions in the nature of things and places so that they all just become abstractions within the order of property. But on the other hand, in terms of the phenomenology of things, there are massive differences between the town square and the lawful forest. So I'm just floating that out there as something that occurred to me while you were talking, and I would love to hear both of your thoughts on that. And then the other question at the moment, I guess, is I think it's such a great phrase, the lawful forest, great concept, wonderful to think about. And it made me ponder what it would mean to be an unlawful forest and whether that's possible. So just a couple of different things to think about.
Thank you. John, should I go first and then hand over to you?
Thank you.
So what we probably didn't do enough of is talk about our kind of conceptual definitions at the start. So it's an excellent opportunity. Thank you very much. Really, when we were looking at the kind of idea of the lawful forest, it drew from the Forest Charter originally, and we were drawing a distinction between the legal forest, and this was the defined forest of the Norman forest laws, which actually had nothing to do with trees. So they called land, they applied these forest laws to a whole range of land, including village commons and even parts of villages. It didn't matter whether there were trees on them, but by calling it the forest, it was then subject to these kind of quite draconian laws that protected the hunting rights of the king, and meant that a whole bunch of communal practices were suddenly outlawed. So you could no longer use them for, so obviously some of them were treated, you could no longer use them for pannage, you could no longer collect mushrooms or charcoal, or there was a whole range of things that were prohibited. And the lawful forest, which was kind of reclaimed through the Forest Charter, at least over a good portion of that land when it was disafforested, similarly is a bit not the trees, but it's actually these kind of claims to public space. And so when you move into an urban centre, there's probably a lot more in common because of that play on words than would probably appear without that definition. In some respects, unlawful forest would have been a fun term to play with, except for the fact that we were dealing with a legal forest as our kind of counter kind of enclosure narrative, because in fact it was created by law. Obviously, a lot of the rights that were claimed under the Forest Charter did relate, however, to the forest, and those are still a little bit connected to that ideas of, you know, trees and what have you, in a way that the public square is not. It kind of needs the forest outside of it to continue to survive. But other aspects of the use of those lands were to do with gatherings and festivities and creating a sense of the populace, the commons, that kind of that commoners' political power and rights, and that those I think can transfer quite directly into the public square. But I'll hand over to John, who's even probably more into the theory than me.
Oh, thanks, Christy. Yes, I mean, it's true. I don't think we really toyed with the unlawful forest. We certainly had this duality constructed of the lawful forest and the legal forest, as Christy explained, and particularly in the originating article in the UNSW Law Journal. So perhaps we hinted at times that the legal forest, with its excessive, you know, obsession with black letter doctrine and the technicalities of the law, is oversteps, you know, is perhaps unlawful, but that is the extent to which we considered questions of unlawfulness. And I suppose I'd only add to Christy's comment as well, is also in an environmental sense, of course, the forest became the town square through processes of deforestation, and, you know, the forest, the trees were put to the till and then to the town, so to speak. So there was this kind of geospatial progression from the forest into the urban forest, which just logically followed. And thanks also for the reference in relation to the situation on Vancouver Island and so on as well. We did sneak in the very last minute in some of our final drafts in chapter 6, a really interesting insights from an article by Esther Van Wagner, who wrote about private forests and whether there could ever actually be truly private forests on Vancouver Island, and also some work from Kirsten Anker as well. So we did in our last minutes of putting this together, looked at what was unfolding in British Columbia of great interest to us. So, but as Christy said, that might be the Lawful Forest Volume 2, the franchise.
That's great. Perhaps I could call in Rod.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation, raising all kinds of ideas. I wanted to pick up just on one small point in the parallel between Terrania and Cleckett Sound, and that is the compromise at the end. You talk about the creation of a World Heritage Site in Cleckett Sound. The compromise in the end, I guess, was creation of a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, but had served, I think, much the same purpose. The question, but there is obviously a lot of a fascinating parallel to the story you tell and BC experience, you know, well worth tracking. The question I wanted to ask was just, you mentioned in passing that the Charter of the Forest lasted for about 600 years, well beyond the Magna Carta. I'd be interested a little more in the background, the history by which the Charter of the Forest gradually evaporated.
John, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, it is, I mean, it was replaced in 1971 by an act of the UK Parliament, which, you know, had some it's a very short act. And so it's got about 2 or 3 sections in it, of which it basically said that the Forest Charter is now abolished. And however, there was a saving provision in paragraph 2 or paragraph 3, which said that the liberties and the forest liberties and privileges and rights and so on will continue on in a pre-existing sense. So it was a curious kind of statute that sought to replace I mean, perhaps it was just a step of modernisation that tried to replace an old charter instrument with a modern piece of, you know, 1970s legislation. But I think it just kind of lay like a bit like our lawful forest, you know, it lay latent. It just sat there, and it remained good law. And I think this is what, as I said in my first half, was this judgment of the Australian High Court in Brown and Tasmania kind of piqued our interest in the lawful forest, because everyone else was rushing off to kind of say, well, this is an important judgment in constitutional law, of course, which it is. But it also had these kind of, you know, subtle references to the public forest estate and the recognition of, you know, forest public rights and so on. And this word recognition was interesting. And some of the justices then went into this kind of history and saying, well, you know, all but one, they kind of followed this recognition line that here's some ancient laws, and that later forestry statutes, for example, from Tasmania, might seek to regulate them or put various caveats or conditions on them, but that nonetheless they continued, they were recognised, in the ancient laws were recognised. And so I suppose our argument is that these kind of oblique references in the High Court judgment gave us this kind of insight into you know, what this could mean in terms of the latency of these ancient forest rights, which, you know, you have to kind of legislate to curtail or to negative. So when the journal was actually launched in Sydney at a law firm, Herbert Smith Freehills in the Sydney CBD, the keynote address in introducing it was from the High Court Justice Michelle Gordon, who was kind of one of the perhaps the less effusive about the kind of forest rights kind of argument. And so we got a kind of a slight little unusual tick off perhaps a bit from Justice Gordon about that, our particular approach in that. But there were other judges that were much more effusive in regard to this kind of latency of the Forest Charter. So it's kind of just one of these things which just flew under the radar. And you know, others have talked about this strange contrast between the Magna Carta, with its emphasis on private individualized rights, and the Forest Charter, which was about, you know, quite an extraordinary piece of legislation, in that it picked up on the rights of the common people. And you know, one can be introduce a bit of hyperbole around this, I suppose, but I think it's Lucy Finchett-Maddock talks about this strange idea of how our memory of the commons is relegated to the archive, and the memories, or should I say the memories of private individualized title and so on, is pushed to the forefront. And you know, it's true of the Forest Charter, it was pushed into the archival back room somewhere, and the Magna Carta was much more front of mind because of its, you know, it spoke to property as individualized and private, and although it wasn't used the word private in that sense, but much more the rights of the powerful, not the rights of the many.
Yeah, thank you. It's fascinating. In some ways, I guess the ancient rights, in a sense, in the Canadian scene, the ancient rights become pushed forward as we look more to Indigenous law in Canada. So there's some interesting parallels there maybe too. Yeah, thank you very much.
I mean, one of the things that I found really exciting, not just about the talk, but also about the article when I read it, and I can guarantee the book when I finally do get to read it, is the fact that it's grounded in a sort of long historiography of studies of utopian literature and sort of utopianism. And one, as I was listening to what you were saying and trying to get a sense of the range of the book, most of what you were saying was based in common law legal systems. Now, I know you make reference to 71 and other stuff, but am I correct in thinking that the bulk of what you're doing is based on common law legal systems?
Yeah, that wasn't an easy, I think, tension to walk sometimes, because obviously there are much bigger,
yeah,
you know, our tendency was to keep looking and looking and looking, and the pattern can be found in a whole range of places. But I think at the core, we were still writing about property law and primarily about common law property law. And so we did attempt primarily to tether it back to that common law. Obviously, we stray into Paris, particularly for the Paris Commune, although there's kind of these links back, you know, to England at the time, as you'd be aware. So that was sort of, we were stretching our thread a little bit there, and it's impossible to talk about Australia correctly without dealing with some of the sort of, you know, the Indigenous, the history and the ongoing presence of Indigenous law in Australia. And so we did try to sort of engage with that, but we were limited in our scope for that, really, because there's one chapter that deals with Australia. There's a number of issues that are dealt with within it. So our kind of attempts to deal with that really needed to point to further literature, you know, on that, and to acknowledge that kind of, so over here there's a whole nother, frankly, a whole nother book that would do justice to those issues. So I think our guiding kind of principle in the sort of foundation was that, you know, while there is a broader, perhaps political critique, I think that you could argue that is a thread that goes through it, we were still anchoring it to the common law, property law, and bringing it back to that. And in some ways it was one boundary that we could try to kind of impose on such a, you know, a broad ranging, long history kind of perspective. John, did you want to talk to that?
Yes, I mean, I think Christy really summed it up, but it you know, it's kind of the boundaries of your field of inquiry have to be predetermined somewhere. So, you know, we did go across the channel, and as Christy said, and but I mean, there would be absolutely fascinating areas to explore, you know, in Scandinavian forests and so on as well. But we simply ran out of word length, and we had only, you know, we had a plate full with what we did, and as you rightly point out, you know, it continues to emerge, as in the forest debates in BC and so on. So it is, you know, I suppose the point about our book was that we couldn't be exhaustive. We just had to be selective in what we chose. And some of the choices were even eclectic and, you know, kind of quirky. But the point was to have this imagery of a continuum across time, which you can't really point to where it started. In fact, we do choose a moment of starting, and that was an enclosure of a community's Linton in the UK. Thank you. There was a wood pastures which the king, the local noble, wanted to enclose for his pigs, and there was kind of this pushback, a successful case against the king brought by the community and the church, which you know, stopped an early example of enclosure. So it's a long history of a long trajectory.
Yeah. I suppose what was lurking behind my question was, as I was listening to it, I was sort of wondering whether there's a sort of continuity of specifically English assumptions and cultural reference points that travels across the common law British Empire. And so, you know, the analogies that you're drawing between what's happening in medieval England and what's happening in Nimbin, you can sort of see a sort of continuity of language that's being invoked and assumptions. And so that was really what lay behind it. I was sort of wondering whether this story really does, it emerges out of England, and then it has sort of echoes over the centuries. But those echoes are tied, I would almost say, to the language, to the terms of reference, to the analogies that are drawn, the vocabulary that's being utilized. I don't know. It's just a thought. I do have to ask one other more prosaic question. When are we going to see it?
when we submitted our final copy, when was it, John? Like it was a small
like May,
revision in October. Yeah. Well, first in May, yeah. But when we submitted the kind of last little bits and bobs, they were like, excellent, it's on track for timely publication in August 2022. So August 2022.
Well, I'm sure we'll be all looking forward to it. Are there any other questions out there? Okay, Bruce.
Yes, this time
it seems, before you ask, did you have a question?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, it's just that it's been rather alarming. I have this impression that there's been an earthquake taking place in Auckland some time because of the movement of your particular screen. However, I'm glad to know that there's not an earthquake. Otherwise, all the books would be coming out of the shelves behind your head.
In Auckland, much more likely to be volcanoes than earthquakes. Just one. Yeah, I'm sorry. I've been wandering around the house, haven't I? And I should have turned the camera on. Just one thing. I was just wondering about the people at Terrania Creek. I remember, that's my generation. I remember those people up there. How much awareness was there, do you think, historical awareness was there among these people to these forms of resistance in the forest, protection of the forest and so on? This is just, I just want to say again how wonderful I think this talk has been. So I'll have to wait until next year like others. But how much, are you, do you know anything, whether these people were aware of this long history of the kind of resistance they were engaging in?
There's an American countercultural scholar called Benjamin Zablocki, and he made the observation that, that the people of the age of Aquarius had very little, knowledge of their historical forebears, and they kind of it just happened. It was a zeitgeist. And I mean, in my former life, I was a solicitor, and in the latter part of being a solicitor, I kind of returned to my home and my father's practice, and he, for whatever reason, he had a quirky practice that involved a weekly visit to Nimbin. So all of these kind of clients of his were original MO, people that set up MOs, and I got to know quite a few of them when I became, I joined his practice, and so this kind of perhaps sparked some of my early interest in this kind of area. And I'm not sure, like they really believed they were doing something new, like this had just never been seen before. And I mean, I never had a conversation with, some of the people that we quote in the book, to the extent to which they said, oh yes, and we drew on the Forest Charter and Kett's Rebellion and the Diggers. I'm not sure that ever, so maybe Zablocki, in talking about America, was right. Maybe there was little appreciation of the historical forebears.
I love the question though, because we've talked about that a lot. We were so struck by some of the similarities in terms of tactics and language and this kind of drawing on this particular conception of legitimacy, and then so struck by the fact that there appeared to be this incredible reinvention. But there must be something cultural, this kind of sense of what is right and what is wrong, that has, and you're right, I think there's a common law kind of legacy to that, but I think you could probably go wider. But there must be something that people are drawing on in terms of, because the themes are just so similar and recurring, that that's what we found so fascinating. But the amnesia factor is also quite fascinating too. Like the effort put into creating it is a really interesting element to it.
I'm starting to wonder, John, whether your father might have had a role in planting these ideas on his weekly trips to England.
Oh, maybe. I mean, he kind of used, he developed a lot of he worked on the kind of structures behind the early MOs. So, the adaptation of what is really a farmer cooperative, dairy farmers cooperatives and banana grower cooperatives and so on, and using them for land holding. So he kind of brought that particular tool into play.
MOB,
but,
multiple occupancy.
Yeah.
Acronym.
I'm not sure about that. Pushy's not around to ask anymore. So, but yeah, it was an interesting, quirky aspect of his practice. You know, most of our clients were called, you know, Rainbow or, you know, Seed of the Forest or something.
Right. Well, I know we're sort of getting a little late in time. Are there other questions out there that people haven't asked? I know Martin has come on screen. Does Martin have a question? Martin,
I don't. I just wanted to say thank you again, but I did want to make sure that I had an opportunity to thank you, Andrew, for this series, given that it's the last one in the year. But am I preempting another question, or?
I did have a quick one. The emphasis, Christy and John, has been on the common law. I wondered whether you toyed with the idea of thinking about equity, because one of the ironies of our present situation in British Columbia is on the old growth forest, the invocation of the injunction by powerful interests, of course, the logging companies, to prevent people from, quote, encroaching on their rights, unquote. And this is where the battlefield in the law is located in terms of whether or not to grant injunctions.
Yeah. I don't think equity is absent in its entirety, but we probably haven't focused on it simply because it didn't, in the, I guess, slightly eclectic examples that we chose, equity didn't really come to the forefront. I think in the United States, the use of the public trust doctrine, obviously, to protect what we would describe as the commons or common rights, is an interesting use, really, of an equitable doctrine. And there's a huge amount you could say, but that hasn't been a big feature in the areas that we've looked at. And so we kind of had to close that rabbit hole off again for the kind of the scope factor. But again, volume two, I mean, there's so much that could be written about it. I agree, because it's a really interesting one. And obviously equity really does have a pretty, you know, the public trust doctrine aside, it does have a really interesting history of really protecting wealth and power. You know, it's been a pretty dominant use of equity. So it would be a really interesting analysis.
It is another example of how difficult words are, particularly legal words, in terms of understanding. You look at a word equity and you think, fair, that must mean fairness, but quite the reverse in terms of the way it's being applied to the forest in British Columbia.
Perhaps I should turn it back to Martin, since Martin
started the session. I couldn't help but think
to end it.
Well, I just couldn't help but think that I'm not sure if Gary Field started the series this year. Was he one? But he was one of the first. He did, right? And he too built this story from the enclosures on out, ending in places like Palestine and things. So, but it's another reminder of just how global, isn't it, these stories are, and how global I think our understandings need to become. So really my thanks to Andrew for bringing all of these different stories together and helping us build the bigger picture. It's not just about putting different cases together, is it? It's about comparing methodologies and approaches and everything else as well. So and I suppose one thing I'm struck with is that it doesn't really strike me that there's any other way we can do this because of the nature of the story, but that it's taken efforts like this for you to do. So thanks to the speakers and to the audience, but especially Andrew. At this point, let me just thank Andrew for putting this series together and hopefully keeping it going. So
it'll certainly be going at least until the Lawful Forest is published. And who knows, after the Lawful Forest has been published, there might even be the necessity for a return visit, you know? Who knows?
What I
wanted to thank both of you very, very much for doing this presentation. It's been Wonderful.
And maybe at some point in the future, as Zoom has been this wonderful way of making connections, but maybe there'll be an opportunity in the years to come for a big grant that brings us all together as well over a small workshop.
Indeed.
So that these
Indeed.
conversations can continue.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Sounds fabulous. Thank you so much for having us.
Indeed.